Bingo.
See lots of people already hopping in. If you would, go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat. Make sure that you have switched to where you are messaging everyone, and just tell us your name and where you're joining us from tonight. We'd love to see where you're joining from. See, hi, Amy. Hi, Curvin. Go ahead and tell us hi from St. Louis. We've got Florida. Hi, Matt, Sarah, Jan. Oh, we've got some Michigan folks here too. Chelsea, of course, San Diego. Paul, good evening. Let's see, Missouri.
Columbia, Maryland.
Maryland. Yeah, there's one from Maryland, my neighbor up here. Let's see, where else? Fort Lauderdale. Lots of people in St. Louis. Another person from Maryland, welcome. Let's see. Hi, Kim, Dylan. Oh, Syracuse, New York. Hi, Eileen. Welcome. Lots of our friends from Florida. Hi, Gerald. Oh, Gerald. Hello. Welcome. Yeah, she really is my neighbor here in Virginia. Let's see. Lots of people coming in. Again, if you're just now coming in, introduce yourself. We'd love to welcome you. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I just want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. We have a really exciting program to, offer you tonight. We've partnered with the White House Historical Association. My name is Dalton Savage. I am an education coordinator for the National Council for History Education. Again, our mission is to uplift educational voices for history education. I have my partner here, Chelsea Gutierrez, another one of our NCHE staff members. I know we have Shauna Liverati in our recording tonight as well. Kathleen Barker, Yasmin. We're just really excited to have everyone here. And then of course, welcome all of you to the webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Ken and Anna and let them tell you about the presentation for tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Super cool to see people from all over the country tuning into this webinar, here in the evening. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. So my name's Ken O'Regan. I work for the White House Historical Association. I am the Assistant Director of Teacher Education. Hello, all of the teachers out there. And I am joined by my colleague, Anna.
Hi, my name is Anna Cutter. I'm the Landry Education Fellow at the White House Historical Association. So I work on teacher professional development with Ken, and I'm also a field trip educator at our new educational museum center, the People's House, a White House Experience. So I mostly will just be monitoring the chat and answering questions at the end. But thank you all for being here.
Peppering in some relevant links as I talk about a few things too. But again, yeah, we're super excited that you all are here. And tonight we're going to look through, to give you a really quick overview of the resources and some teacher professional development opportunities we have available with the association coming up. And then we're going to dive into what we like to call White House 101. We're going to tell you a lot about the White House. You're hearing a lot about the White House in the news right now because there was a big election 2 days ago. But we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into this historic building. So before doing that, who's the White House Historical Association? Who are we? Most people know us as the Christmas ornament people. If you ever gotten one of those White House Christmas ornaments during the holidays, those are made by us. That's one of our primary fundraising initiatives. Those started back in 1981, but really we were founded in 1961 through the initiatives of First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy to help the White House collect and exhibit the very best artifacts of American history and culture. So we are a private, nonprofit educational organization with a mission to enhance the understanding and appreciation of the White House. Not the White House. I do not work in the fiscal White House. I do not work for the government. We're not a federal organization or anything like that. But we work very closely with the White House, and we're also neighbors. We're pretty much right across the street. Now, telling you a little bit about all of our free online educational resources that we have. They're all available at whitehousehistory.org/education. There's many ways you can actually get there. These educational resources are designed to help you and your students better understand American history and, to some degree, world history by exploring and interpreting it through the lens of the White House. And as we'll explore later in the presentation, the White House is so much more than just where the president lives and works. We at the association strive to tell a diverse and relatable story of this exceptional place in America, moving beyond just presidents to talk about first family and children, talk about the important events that have happened at the White House, the free and enslaved laborers who built the White House, protests and celebrations that have happened there, and much more. So we have a few different or many different types of resources available. We have something that we call classroom resource packets, a kind of our bread and butter. These take looks at different topics in American history as you can kind of see them through the White House. We have fun anywhere activities related to the White House, sort of more crafty things for elementary teachers, art teachers, LibGuides, which are compendiums of primary and secondary sources related to different White House content. We love working with National History Day. Every year we have all sorts of National History Day resources on our website. We've got virtual tours and video tours of the White House, educational videos related to the White House, and we're super excited that earlier this year we released a game with iCivics called Brief the Chief, where you are tasked as a fictional advisor to a real president and advising them on navigating and decision-making during a real historical event. So those are some cool resources that we have to offer, but we also have a really great professional development opportunity coming up for teachers, and that is our White House History Teacher Institute, our premier summer PD program. Applications for that open on January 6th. At the White House History Teacher Institute, you will discover the wider history of this iconic building and how you can use the stories of the White House to enhance your classroom and your teaching. So this is a 5-day in-person program. It's in Washington, D.C., and it features discussions with historians, site visits. Of course, we go to the White House for a tour, inquiry-based learning activities, sessions facilitated by our master teachers who are alums of our program, guest speakers, and of course, the opportunity to network and work with fellow teachers from all over the country. We offer 2 sessions this summer, July 7th to the 11th and July 14th to the 18th. It is application-based, so unfortunately, we can't take everyone who applies for it, but if you are selected, it does include a $1,000 travel stipend to make sure that you can get to the program, cover some of your costs. Maybe you need to cover some childcare or something. And we also provide you with a hotel room for 6 nights from Sunday night through Friday night, so you can leave Saturday. I just threw this up on the screen, but this will of course get shared. There's a QR code here to join our mailing list. If you're interested in that program or other resources, we only email like 4 to 6 times per year. And when applications for this program open, we'll be sure to reach out to our mailing list. Let's get into White House 101 now. Let's get into our content. So we're going to go through over 200 years of this building, of the Executive Mansion. This is, of course, a recent photograph of the White House, the south portico of it. Now, the White House has changed a lot as the needs of the government and the presidency has changed over time. This modern White House has to serve multiple roles as a home, as an office, as a museum, and as a stage for the American people, for the American government, for the presidency. And in this program, we're going to take a look at how the leadership and tenures of different presidents and different events have left their mark on the White House, and how these changes can also represent our nation as a whole. Let's begin with a basic understanding of the location of the White House. The White House sits in the heart of the capital city of this country, Washington, D.C., on the East Coast between Virginia and Southern Maryland on the Potomac River. Going a little bit closer, Google Maps, famous address of the White House is 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue Northwest. So you see here, D.C. is designed on a grid system, intersecting diagonal roads, including Pennsylvania Avenue, going past the White House and leading to the Capitol building. White House sits in a national park called the President's Park, which includes Lafayette Square to the north, the Ellipse to the south, north and south lawns, as well as it's flanked by the Eisenhower Executive Office building and the Treasury building. So this is a modern map, but let's go back to before the White House existed. We often think of the Residence Act of 1790 as the official beginning of Washington, D.C., and of the White House story, or the start of the construction in 1792, but there's a lot of talk about before then. A little bit different from our modern Google Maps image. This is Virginia circa 1612. This is a map attributed to English explorer, soldier, and colonial governor John Smith. Archaeological evidence indicates that native peoples were actually settled in the area of the White House at least 4,000 years ago. And the earliest native people settled here were the Anacostans, which are noted in contemporary sources as the Nacotchtank, and eventually the neighboring Piscataway and Pamunkey peoples. So the confluence of what are now known as the Potomac and Anacostia rivers provided many natural resources: fish, wild game, fertile soil for agriculture. Stone was abundant in this area for the construction of tools, and beyond the natural bounty found here, rivers also provided trading routes for native peoples. So all of these advantages are what led native populations to settle in the area, and it's actually all of these same reasons that led to European colonists seeking to take this land for themselves. Slide. A closer look at what we were looking at on the map before. That blue star in the middle is roughly where the White House is today. I mentioned the village of Nacotchtank that is circled in red there, and then you can see the Potomac River underlined there. So we are not oriented to the north here. This map is not. North is kind of this way on the map right now if you're following along at home. So one of the Anacostan people's initial contacts with European colonizers was with a Jamestown colonist, the previously mentioned Captain John Smith. The Anacostan people initially avoided disruption of their way of life by seeking to avoid conflict with colonizers, but this eventually becomes unavoidable, and the village was abandoned, and the Anacostan people integrated with the nearby Piscataway people. Here's a close-up of a 1670 map with portions of Virginia, Maryland. Not even 3/4 of a century, excuse me, after John Smith published the map we were just looking at. You can see the Potomac and Anacostan rivers labeled. Yes, they are labeled there. You can see them labeled at center. And then you also see a Turkey Buzzard Point labeled right there. That's a name that actually survives today as DC's Buzzard Point neighborhood. So what's important to note here is that the names of the native communities that previously populated the area are gone, including the Anacostans. European encroachment and the seizure of land, often by force of violence, had mostly pushed native groups out of this area. So by 1670, all of the land of future Washington, D.C. was in the hands of colonial traders, farmers, and other settlers. Wealthy plantation owners brought enslaved Africans to the area. The quality soil of the area meant incredible wealth could be generated by the planting and sale of tobacco crops. So it's tobacco trading and storage that gives rise to the first European towns in the D.C. area: Alexandria, Virginia, and Georgetown, Maryland, which is now part of D.C. Any remaining cohesive native communities had been pushed, relocated, or absorbed into other villages and tribes to the south and west of modern DC proper, but native people and communities were and are still present in the larger area, and Native Americans still live and persist in the District of Columbia and the immediate area today. Moving ahead more than a century, the land on which DC would sit becomes valuable plantation land, as I mentioned, occupied by plantation owners of modest to exorbitant wealth, as well as hundreds and hundreds of enslaved African workers. Another wealthy plantation owner with hundreds of enslaved laborers and a large estate a bit further south down the Potomac, who ends up picking the exact location of the new capital of the young United States. This man, of course, is our commander-in-chief of the new Continental Army in the battle for independence, George Washington. So America gains its independence, Constitution is finally ratified, the young nation is ready to establish a permanent seat of government, creating an entirely new federal city with the Residence Act of 1790. This enables President George Washington to choose this exact piece of land along the Potomac River for the new capital. Coincidentally or not, this new capital city is also a relatively short horseback ride from Washington's own private estate downriver, Mount Vernon. Washington asks a man named Pierre Charles L'Enfant to lay out the city. So here we go back to that Google Maps image. Here we have the Residence Act of 1790 or a map from about 1800 of the layout. You can see how this has kind of stayed similar. Now, L'Enfant's plan included space for what he called a president's palace. His vision for a house for the president would have been 4 times the size of what we actually ended up with today. not really a good message to send if we have a new nation, we just got out from underneath a king, but we're going to build a presidential palace. It's not favored by the founders. The massive size, not favored by the founders. President's house becomes the preferred moniker. L'Enfant's stubborn in other areas of his planning, and he ends up getting fired after less than a year of service, butting heads with colleagues. L'Enfant is replaced by a Maryland surveyor at center here by the name of Andrew Ellicott. He keeps many of L'Enfant's ideas, and working alongside Ellicott is Benjamin Banneker. He's a free black Marylander who is previously a colleague of Ellicott, and he's a talented surveyor and polymath. The Banneker name is also found around the DC area today. Now, to build a house for the president, let's have a contest. It's announced by the commissioners with a prize of $500 or medal of that value. George Washington gets to be the major decider in the winning design, although he will never actually live in the White House. He's the only president to have never resided there. And James Hoban, an Irish-born and trained architect, is the winner. And we can see a wax likeness of him up in the corner here. And one of his earliest surviving sketches of his winning design. Pretty simple design in the neoclassical and federal style of architecture, and the founders are intentional in this kind of style of architecture because they kind of want to have a little callback to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, as they do with elements of their political philosophies in this young nation. But again, you can see many of the modern elements of the White House have survived here. The core of Hoban's design has remained unchanged for pretty much the last 225 years. Some similarities and differences, obviously that rectangular shape, the design and patterns of the windows are there. New things, there's a fountain in the front yard. There's a portico added, fancy word for porch on the front of it. And of course, there are some low wings on the east and west sides of the building that are added later. So this is a basic overhead map of the modern White House complex, and the first thing we've circled here is the executive residence. And here is James Hoban's original floor plan for that. You can see the rooms are designed to be of varying shapes and sizes, and they provide for a variety of occasions and guests that might have been visiting the president or doing business or meeting the first family. So there's certainly been some changes, but pretty much this is the same one we were just looking at, just with the stuff labeled there. So there's been some changes, but that modern floor plan pretty much survives today if we want to compare these two. There's just been some core changes. Biggest difference is on the west or left side of the screen here, a staircase being removed to make room for a larger state dining room. Providing you with some spatial references, here's a layout of the three main floors of the White House, of the executive residence building. Ground floor is a walkout basement. The first floor, or known as the state floor, is what we were just looking at. And then the second floor is private quarters for the president and for the first family. And also not featured here is a more modern third floor on top, also private quarters, and then two sub-basements, more modern features. We will get to those later. Now, White House construction begins in 1792, which is the same year as the design contest was held. And yes, as I mentioned earlier, enslaved laborers were used in the initial construction of the White House. African Americans, both enslaved and free, provided the bulk of the labor. There are also some European laborers, including Scottish stonemasons, who did detail work on the building as well. Now, at right here, you see something that says Slavery in the President's Neighborhood. This is a research initiative that we've been working on at the White House Historical Association for many years. Our historians work very hard on it. They're working to uncover the names and stories of the enslaved men and women that worked on the initial construction of the White House, but also, lived and worked in the White House under different presidential administrations. 9 United States presidents made use of enslaved labor while they were the president, while they were in the White House. This is a list of names compiled by our historians so far of enslaved laborers who helped build the White House as well as the Capitol building. Many people worked on both buildings. The first residents of the White House move in late 1800 after 8 years of construction. Now, the White House isn't completely done when President John Adams and First Lady Abigail Adams move in. The largest room in the White House is the East Room, and you see that here. Again, not yet completed. Plaster is still drying. There's exposed brick. Doors aren't put in the house. There's a hole where a staircase hasn't been yet. And Abigail Adams sees that this room isn't really suitable for much except for hanging of the president's laundry. Again, biggest room in the White House, and she doesn't think that the president's underwear should be hanging up outside. Understandable. Today, the East Room is actually one of the fanciest rooms in the White House, and it's the main event space in the White House. So very, very different from the hanging laundry that we see here. Something you'll also see in this picture from 2015 is the Obama's dog Sunny rolling around to the ground, which is a reminder that the White House is still a family home. Now, the Adamses were only in the White House for about 4 months because John Adams loses his reelection to his frenemy, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson comes in and decides to really spruce up the place. He fancies himself a bit of an architect. He adds these 2 colonnades circled in red on the east and west side. He also makes substantial improvements to the actual grounds of the White House, adding paths, gardening, fencing, all of these different things. Stone wall, big improvements over the near construction site that it was when the Adamses moved in. Jefferson really makes the White House a fitting and more functional place for the nation's leader. Now, the colonnades I was talking about, we've got modern photos in here. They were initially added as storage and service areas, and also bathrooms were in there. It's also very, very likely that enslaved laborers had their living quarters within these structures at some point in their history. So here's how those colonnades look today. West Colonnade is very similar to its original design. That's where you see the president walking from the White House down that West Colonnade to the Oval Office, that 45-second commute to work from their house. And the East Colonnade has been heavily modified, and we'll discuss that later. Another major change that comes to the White House is it burns down. We're probably all waiting for that one. It's caused by fire. During the War of 1812, British troops set fire to the White House on August 24th, 1814. British forces defeat a small American force outside the capital city, and they move through Washington, D.C., setting fire to important government buildings, including the Capitol building, Treasury, and the White House. The interior and the furnishings of the White House are completely disordered, but in this contemporary image here, you can see that the exterior walls pretty much remain standing. How do we get here? How do we get to the British burning down the White House, mere decades after we've thrown off the yoke of the British monarchy and gained our independence? What brings the United States back into war? So when the United States secures its independence, these 2 nations still hold neighboring territories in North America and were vying for expansion in North America. On the seas as well, the Royal Navy was interrupting American trade with Napoleonic France, who was Britain's chief enemy at the time, and further was pursuing a policy of impressment against sailors on U.S. ships who were deemed to be British subjects. The British did not recognize naturalized American citizens who were formerly British subjects. They did not recognize them as being anything but British subjects. And they said, therefore, they are subject to service in the Royal Navy. This policy of impressment of what we thought to be American sailors was garnering significant anti-British sentiment in the United States. Key example of this policy is actually being shown here in the 1807 Chesapeake Leopard Affair. Throw it into the chat if you've heard about it before, but it's a pretty relevant little piece of history. A British warship, the HMS Leopard, attacks and quickly overwhelms the ill-prepared American warship USS Chesapeake in order to arrest 4 supposed British deserters who are on board the Chesapeake. They were men who were formerly British sailors or deemed to be British subjects. One of them is eventually hanged too. An interesting side note here is that some of our offices at the White House Historical Association are in the historic Commodore Stephen Decatur House in D.C. Stephen Decatur is killed in 1820 in a duel with Commodore James Barron, who was at the time the captain of the USS Chesapeake. And this duel largely came from a beef that started between the 2 men based on Decatur's ill feelings and distaste for Barron's conduct and really failure to protect his ship and his men in the Chesapeake Leopard Affair. So anyhow, issues on land and issues at sea are what lead the U.S. to declare war in June of 1812. This is the first time the United States declares war on another nation. The United States saw this as an opportunity for territorial expansion westward as well as northward into British Canada, especially as British military forces were tied up in wars against France and her allies. So when war is declared, the United States attempts invasions of British Canada that were seen to be easy opportunities for victory. Not the case. They don't work out. They're brought to a halt on land, but the United States does find naval victories on the Great Lakes. Now, a key component of the latter half of the war was the Chesapeake campaign, as in the Chesapeake Bay, not the Chesapeake ship we were just talking about. The British blockade the bay. They're poised to attack Washington and Baltimore. Disagreements in the cabinet of President James Madison and ineffectual military leadership and honestly training and preparedness result in a British land force attacking Washington from the north, quickly overwhelming a smaller, inexperienced American force, and, as I said, marching on the capital city. The British burn the White House, the Capitol, the Treasury, other government buildings. The British are actually forced to evacuate the city after about 25 hours of occupation. But again, key government buildings are burned, and the Washington Navy Yard is also burned, mostly in part due to the Americans burning it on purpose so the British didn't capture ships there and war supplies there. Now, when the White House is burned, a handful of important documents and objects, including the famous Gilbert Stuart painting of George Washington, were rescued from the fire. You might know this story or a version of it. There's a popular narrative, which is a myth, that First Lady Dolly Madison herself was responsible for the rescue of the portrait. It was actually Paul Jennings, pictured later in his life at Wright, who was serving as President Madison's enslaved valet, who wrote about what really happened in his memoir, A Colored Man's Reminiscences of James Madison. And he describes the portrait as being saved by a group of enslaved and free White House workers. So it wasn't Dolly herself cutting this portrait down, putting it under her arm and running out. It was Dolly saying, hey, we need to save that. And it was actually some enslaved and free workers who truly got up on the ladders and saved this important piece of art. Now, White House burns. The British leave Washington after about a day. They move north to attack Baltimore. They attempt to capture or destroy Fort McHenry at the entrance to Baltimore Harbor, and they are unsuccessful. Fort McHenry remains in American hands, and the Star-Spangled Banner continued to wave over the fort and Baltimore Harbor. It's where the Star-Spangled Banner, Francis Scott Key, that's what we're talking about there. Now, the British actually suffer another decisive defeat shortly after this in the southern theater of the war at the Battle of New Orleans, where their attacking force is soundly defeated by future President Andrew Jackson in January of 1815. This battle actually takes place after the Treaty of Ghent, being depicted on the right-hand side here. The Treaty of Ghent, which ended the war, was signed. News of the treaty and the treaty itself had not yet reached North America at the time of the Battle of New Orleans. But the treaty restores relations between the two countries, it ends the war, and it returns the territories of each to what they were before the war, to status quo antebellum, as you would say for my Latin scholars. Now, White House is burned down. After the fire, Congress talks about moving the president's house to another location or even moving the entire capital to another city. President James Madison knows the importance of the building as a national symbol, and he says, we will rebuild it right here on its original foundation. He brings James Hoban back to do the job, the original architect. White House is rebuilt in just under 3 years thanks to a lot of construction shortcuts like using wood instead of brick. These shortcuts are eventually going to become an issue, and we'll talk about that later. The home is rebuilt by late 1817, and James Monroe moves in. And the reconstruction also brings back some ideas for some other architectural additions. One more myth I want to dispel real quick is that the White House was painted white to cover the burn marks. That's not actually true either. The building was getting a lime-based whitewash on its sandstone as early as 1798 to protect that stone from winter freezes and moisture intrusion. So it had been white since long before that. And the White House actually gets its name. It was a colloquial term that was used even before the War of 1812. It was in papers around that time, but it's in 1901 that President Theodore Roosevelt officially names it the White House. Prior to that, it was officially being called the Executive Mansion in Washington, as you can see on the letterhead. Teddy didn't want people to get confused about what Executive Mansion we're talking about because many states were using the term Executive Mansion for their governor's residences. So he officially makes that change to White House. It's the official name in 1901. Over the years, the building is painted white over and over again. It's eventually stripped of all that white paint between 1989 and 1996 to restore it, and that uncovers a lot of the original stone detail from those Scottish stone nations, as well as some scorch marks from the 1814 fire that you can see circled right there. So, of course, the White House is rebuilt, and we get this idea to add some new features to it too around that time. And those things are the north and the south porticos of the White House. This is an 1807 illustration of what they were meant to look like. The south portico is added in 1824, north portico 1829, 1830, and with those porticos being added, we get kind of the modern image of the White House that we know about today. And this is actually the first known photograph of the White House taken in 1846. The structure is this is the largest home in the United States until after the Civil War. Speaking of the Civil War, we were just talking about the War of 1812. War comes to the front steps of the White House again with the American Civil War in 1861. And at that time, the White House is virtually on the front lines. Earlier in the war, Union forces go across the Potomac River and secure the southern banks of the Potomac in Virginia, which had seceded from the Union. And Washington, D.C.'s fortifications all around the city are greatly increased. The telegraph office for the War Department is just across the street. President Lincoln frequently walks back and forth between the White House, the telegraph office, to read telegrams coming in from the front lines, work with his field commanders in real time to actually conduct the Civil War and, really fulfill his role as commander-in-chief. So at left here, you actually see an image of what was known as the Cassius M. Clay Battalion in April 1861 at the outbreak of war. This is 300 men organized by Cassius M. Clay, who was Lincoln's soon-to-be minister to Russia. These are mostly a civilian force that armed themselves to protect the White House early in the war. And the men at the center of the photo there, who don't have rifles and bayonets, is believed to be Lincoln and his cabinet. And on the right there, of course, you see a photograph of President Lincoln on the second floor of the White House in his office, which is now the Lincoln bedroom. So despite the war, we see the continuation of the White House as a family home. The way soldiers took Tad Lincoln in as one of their own, a lot of them called him Third Lieutenant Lincoln, which is a fake rank ascribed to him. And of course, soldiers are standing guard around the White House. As a young boy, Tad Lincoln, especially after the death of his brother Willie, Tad's childhood was a mixture of war and mischief. He had his own military uniform. You see him in that here. This is an 1865 photo of Tad in front of the White House. So it's really interesting to contrast the American Civil War happening, across the river from the White House with the innocence of child family life, being thrown into all this. So this building you see here, the White House, is supposed to be both a home and office for the president, specifically the second floor, which is both the bedrooms and the office space for the first family. Most presidents and first families are able to make sense of this space, but at the turn of the century, we get a large young family moving in, and of course, that is the Roosevelts. They move in 1901 upon the assassination of William McKinley. Teddy has 6 children. When they move into the White House, they're having trouble making sense of the place, making it work for their family. And on the right side, you actually see a drawing by First Lady Edith Roosevelt, trying to get her family up there, as well as still have the offices for the president. They endure this for about a year, and then Edith Roosevelt says enough is enough. She hires an architect by the name of Charles F. McKim on how we can handle the overcrowding. And McKim actually says we need to totally rethink the way the White House works. We need to totally redesign and add on to this building and create a separate space for your living quarters, separate space for guests to come, separate space for the offices of the president. To highlight the need for this, Teddy Roosevelt's children, when Archie was ill, Quentin snuck their pony Algonquin up into the second floor bedroom of the elevator, through an elevator, with Charles Reeder depicted here as well, the adult that you see here. Footman for the Roosevelts, was Quentin's partner in crime, actually said, yeah, sure, let's put a pony in the elevator and take him up to the second floor of the White House. Not conducive for doing work as the president of the United States. But Teddy Roosevelt once said, I don't think any family has ever enjoyed the White House more than we have. Let's get moving with this renovation. The Roosevelts renovate the main house, turn the second floor all into private living and entertaining space. So now we need a new office space, and this is where we get the creation of what becomes the West Wing. Initially, the Roosevelts built what was a temporary executive office building where there was a series of greenhouses that had been constructed from 1857 up until 1901, continuously expanded. That was what the West Wing of the White House looked like when the Roosevelts came in. They actually tear down these greenhouses, expose the original West Colonnade that Jefferson had added, and they add a new office structure at the end of that West Colonnade. And you can see it completed here, that temporary executive office building, and how neatly and architecturally it actually works with that existing colonnade. And here is the layout of those temporary executive offices. You can see the president's room exits directly into the cabinet room, very useful for holding meetings. Something interesting here is that there's no Oval Office. So no Oval Office here yet. This layout is actually short-lived. We get our first Oval Office added in 1909 during the William Howard Taft administration. President Taft moves in, decides that he needs to enlarge the West Wing. He already needs more office space. That building that was intended to be temporary is now permanent if we're renovating and adding to it. Part of that renovation was adding the Oval Office. So you can see it here circled at left on the Taft floor plan. And then another Roosevelt further renovates the White House, or further renovates the West Wing in 1934, and that would be Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He shifts the position of the Oval Office to its current location, where it remains today, and really shuffles around the rooms inside of the West Wing, and actually adds kind of a mezzanine level there, as well as a basement level to it. Even more office space. This is an aerial photograph of the White House complex and the president's neighborhood taken in 1919. So you can see the expanded West Wing circled in red there, and the original location of that Oval Office. Here is an image of the Oval Office during the Kennedy administration in its current spot, with a door that walks out to the Rose Garden and to the Colonnade. Another addition that comes to the West Wing of the White House, or outside of the West Wing, was an outdoor swimming pool in 1975 during the Ford administration. Ford was a lifelong athlete. The pool in the White House that FDR had actually put into the West Wing, or the West Colonnade, had been covered over during the Nixon administration. It's still there, but it's got the press briefing room on top of it to this day. Ford says, I need a pool. I don't know how I'll survive without a pool. So he gets this outdoor swimming pool dug. During the digging of this swimming pool, there is actually archaeological items found that point to the Native American occupation or inhabitants of this space that we're talking about back at the beginning of the presentation. They find some quartz points, broken biface, blanks, and fragments of pottery. So this is a reminder of Native American settlement in this area before European colonial encroachment. So Teddy Roosevelt adds what becomes the modern West Wing. They also need to add what becomes the modern East Wing. That dates back to that 1902 Roosevelt renovation. The reconstruction of the East Colonnade begins in 1902. It essentially uncovers the foundation of Jefferson's old East Terrace that was raised in the 1860s and builds a new East Wing on top of it as a social and visitor entrance. And you can see that finished visitor entrance here. Really, this was meant to control the flow of traffic into the White House and stop people from literally going in and out the front door, especially when entertaining. More space is needed again in this East Wing when Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes to the White House. He renovates the East Wing. You can see him laying the cornerstone here in a 1942 image. With these changes, the East Wing is expanded to include a second floor, more office spaces, and what becomes like the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, secure space underneath the White House that you sometimes see images of the president in on September 11th, the raid on Osama bin Laden. So why do you think FDR took advantage of 1942 to do this renovation and add pretty much a bunker underneath? What's going on in 1942? I'm imagining everyone either in the chat or at home is saying World War II. It was the perfect cover, renovate the on top, build a secure secret bunker underneath. Now, the East Wing today is really the base of operations for the White House Visitor's Office and the First Lady. And it's First Lady Rosalind Carter who set the precedent of having a dedicated office of the First Lady in the East Wing, and she creates the First Lady Chief of Staff position in 1979. These are not required or regulated government positions, but the First Lady and her office can play a really big role in helping the executive branch and the presidency achieve its goals. Now, here is the way the East Wing looks today. The East Wing remains the visitor entrance of the White House, and if you've ever taken a public tour of the White House, you enter through the East Wing exactly as the Teddy Roosevelt's intended you to in 1901 when they started that renovation. So we mentioned when Hoban rebuilt the White House in 1814, he took a ton of shortcuts. These shortcuts are coming back to get us now. In addition to these, over time, there's internal changes that happen in adding modern heating, plumbing, electricity, wiring, cutting into the walls. President Calvin Coolidge takes the third floor attic and turns it into a fully finished third floor living space. This starts to take a really significant toll on the structure of the main White House building of the executive residence. When President Harry Truman moves in 1945, he knows that the building is in distress. This doesn't stop him from wanting to add a balcony. Truman wants a balcony on the second floor so he can have some private outdoor space. He also actually really hates those sunshades, those awnings that are down there, and that's part of his argument for a balcony. In surveying for the balcony, engineers actually find that the White House is quite literally on the verge of collapse. Truman says, okay, we need to do a full structural renovation of the building. Highlighting that, here are some pictures of the interior of the White House when they started doing that renovation. Or prior to that, there are giant cracks going through the brickwork, giant, load supporting main beams were cracking completely through there. The building is really literally on the verge of collapse. So Truman says, let's save the structure, let's renovate it, let's rebuild it, kind of just like Madison after that 1814 fire. So the Trumans kind of move out of the White House across the street to Blair House, and that main residence, that main White House building is gutted and renovated and totally rebuilt from the inside out from 1948 to 1952, what we call the Truman renovation. And on top of that, they do a skeleton of steel on the inside of the building. They dig out underneath. They add 2 levels of sub-basements for more storage space, more offices, modern HVAC units down there. Really makes the building a lot more modern than it was. And here's the inside of the White House during that renovation. A lot of the interior or original interior elements of the White House were lost in the effort to keep the White House standing. I mean, they totally gutted this thing. They're driving dump trucks in. You can see a dump truck inside of the White House here. After the renovations, they rebuild the White House, and they pretty much make the interior look exactly the same as it did before, but everything except the paneling of the walls of the state dining room was recreations of the original stuff. So if you go into the White House today, unless you're in the state dining room and you're looking at all of the wonderful, woodwork and scroll work up on the ceilings and everything like that, that all originates during the Truman administration. When these renovations are taking place, a lot of the building material from the original White House build, as well as the 1817 rebuild, is removed and it's shipped off to private citizens who request it. Not really great historic preservation. It's hard to imagine this kind of thing today, especially considering Truman's desire to preserve the White House as a symbol. There wasn't really much interest in the nitty-gritty and the depth of what is modern historic preservation. And this is where the association's founder, First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy, comes in. When she moves into the White House in 1961, she realizes that there's really not a lot of historic furnishings left, not a lot of historic artwork around. Up until that time, each first family had been allowed to sell off whatever furniture they didn't care for in order to furnish the house to their taste. Mrs. Kennedy finds pieces of furniture on the grounds of the White House dating back to the Monroe administration, dating back to about 1817, and this kickstarts her vision to make the White House a special place for all Americans to enjoy their history. She hires professional curators and pushes for legislation to protect the staterooms and the permanent White House collection as a commitment to our shared history. So the association was established as a nonprofit partner of the White House to assist in these work. Now, speaking of White House curators, the White House cannot operate without the dedication and hard work of the resident staff. Pictured here is the retirement party for Eugene Allen, who was a longtime White House resident staff member, and he's smiling in the middle there, kind of balding gentleman, mustache, big smile, right in the middle of that big group of people. James Ketchum, a former White House curator, once said, quote, "The White House is just like a small town. You have a florist shop, a small electrical shop, a carpenter shop, a movie theater, a swimming pool, all under one roof." Important thing to realize, especially now in an election season, we're going to have a different administration coming in, different party coming into the White House in January. Most of the staff that work in the White House, they are permanent. They are not, part of the, Republican administration or Democratic administration. They stay on through different administrations. They're not appointees. And again, a key example of that is Eugene Allen at center there. He worked in the White House for 46 years before he retired. So these staff members, they deal with 132 different rooms in the White House, and keeping them running and keeping them in tip-top shape so the president, can run this country and exhibit, the best that we have to offer. So The design of the White House today remains true to its original design from 1792, but the building has gone through a lot, as I've told you, over its 220-year history. It has to juggle its past and its present, while it has to still serve those main roles that are needed by the President of the United States. And these are roles that have grown over time. As I said at the start, these roles, the White House must function as a home for the first family, for first kids, as an office for the president, as the seat of the executive branch, as a museum to collect our shared history and exhibit the best that we have to offer, and as a stage for some of our most important events, for bill signings, things like that. It's a really important visual place, a really important symbol of American history. So with that, I know I'm kind of coming up on the edge of time as far as being able to hopefully answer some questions. I'm kind of scrolling through the chat here. I see people saying World War II, and I said, what's happening in 1942?
I see one question
Sure.
in the chat. It mentions the story that you told about Dolly Madison saving the painting.
Yes.
And so when and why did that become such a prominent story?
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic, and it's something I would encourage anyone who's interested in that to explore our website, because in addition to all those educational resources, we have lots of historian authored articles and things like that. We have some stuff that really dives into that. So when Dolly leaves the White House as it's imminently about to be burned by the British in 1814, she doesn't really bring much with her outside of her purse and a little bit of silver from the table that is set for dinner, a little bit of silver, true silverware. And she tasks, freeing enslaved White House workers with saving that portrait. Now, over time in Dolly's writings, she starts to talk a little bit more about how she saved that portrait. At this time, Dolly Madison is a First Lady of the United States, former First Lady of the United States. She remains very prominent and popular in Washington, even after the death of her husband. She's very much a part of the White House neighborhood. So Dolly kind of tells and retells this story. Other people tell and retell this story, and it sort of like builds a little bit of a myth around her. It's interesting because I mentioned Paul Jennings' memoir. Paul Jennings wrote that memoir in 1860, but the story of the Dolly Madison myth, it's still out there, but we had a firsthand account from a man who at the time was enslaved. We had a firsthand account of what actually happened. So there's a really interesting thing to think about there as far as the storytelling and myth making of, the First Lady of the United States versus the word of a formerly enslaved African American. So it's something really interesting, to kind of dive into. But it's over time, gradually, Dolly kind of builds that myth around herself.
Nice, thank you.
Mhm.
One other question you mentioned about this being a home for a family, and you did mention the story of the pony with the elevator. Do
Yeah.
you or Anna have any stories of White House pets that you find to be really interesting, or any favorite of the first
Okay.
family's pets?
Okay, how much time do we have? So that's actually a fun thing because White House pets are a really relatable topic for students, honestly, of all ages. When we think about family pets right now, we're thinking about cats and dogs, but so many different presidential administrations, so many first families had all sorts of different pets. And I mean, there are some wild White House pet stories out there. And there's two that I like to tell that kind of go in tandem with each other. The first one is the story of Rebecca Raccoon. And some of you might know this, especially if you've, come to any of our other stuff or looked at our resources online. Rebecca Raccoon comes to the White House during the Coolidge administration. The Coolidge family is sent a raccoon, which is intended to be eaten for Thanksgiving dinner. It's I think possibly by a family in Missouri, but I might be wrong. I need to consult my sources on that. So I'm of the understanding that when raccoon is cooked well, it can be quite delicious, but this live raccoon comes to the White House And the Coolidge just say, one, we don't want to eat it, and two, look at her, she's adorable. First Lady Grace Coolidge takes Rebecca as a pet, takes her on walks around the White House grounds, lets her play in bathtubs in the White House with a little wet bar of soap. The raccoon bats the soap around inside of the White House. And, there are pictures out there of Grace Coolidge walking around holding a pet raccoon on a chain leash and smiling. And she also built on the grounds of the White House, she builds a little, or has built, like a little tree house for Rebecca to live in and hang out in and get out of the sun. When the Coolidges leave the White House, they give Rebecca to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., but that tree house remains. And during the Hoover administration, a possum moves into the tree house. And people start kind of talking about, oh, there's a possum living on the White House grounds in the treehouse. How about that? There's pictures out there of White House police officers just picking up this wild possum and taking pictures with it and everything. Here's where the story just goes off the rails. At the same time that possum comes to the White House, nearby Hyattsville High School in Maryland, just up the road from the White House, the boys' baseball team loses their live animal mascot, which is a possum. Probably not the same possum that's at the White House, but the boys hear that there's a possum living at the White House. So they write to President Hoover and they ask if they can borrow the White House possum. Hoover, wanting to help the boys up the road and the baseball team, Hoover gives the possum to the boys' baseball team in Hyattsville High School, and the boys actually go on to win their championship. And they also captured championships, I think, in like track and field as well as soccer that spring with this lucky possum. And the boys' baseball team, they return the possum to the White House with a letter, and they say, oh, we won the championship. Thank you so much. And Hoover responds with this letter that is just so incredibly serious. So thank you, gentlemen, for bringing, Billy Possum back to the White House. We'll note these deeds and his successes on his permanent personnel record. Please let it be known that the White House possum remains available to the athletic teams in Prince George's County, Maryland, should he ever be of need again. Like yours very truly, Herbert Hoover. So just really interesting, very strange White House pet story, but that is my favorite one to talk about Billy Possum.
No, thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
One of the other questions that I see in the chat too, we have several questions. So guys, if you have any questions, please place them in the chat and we're going to try to get to as many as we can. I have a question that asks about, the renovations that you've discussed throughout the history of the White House. Do we know how much these renovations cost? And are there any current plans or ideas for additional renovations or improvements to the White House today?
Yeah, so had I been more on my game, this is something that I've pulled up in the past because this question comes, there's questions about the renovations and the costs and all of that. I know it somewhere I had the cost for the original 1817 rebuild. I mean, that stuff is out there and it is possible to find. A really interesting thing about the Truman renovation and the addition of the Truman balcony that preceded that. Truman really kind of had to fight with the federal government to get funds approved to do the renovation of the actual interior of the White House itself, but he couldn't actually get funding for the addition of that balcony on the second floor. So Truman actually self-funded that. And I think the cost in like 1948 dollars was like $17,000 or something like that. So it wasn't terribly expensive to be added. Information about those costs are out there. That's stuff that I would just have to dig to find. But those things are out there. Now, are there any current renovations planned for the White House? Now, with Jackie Kennedy kind of enshrining the history of the White House and trying to make sure that things don't get destroyed or knocked down again or anything like that, it's very difficult to change major elements of the White House. Some renovations do happen. The Oval Office is renovated somewhat often, every couple of decades or so. They will, strip everything out of it and they will lay a new floor and fix up the ceiling and all of those types of things, but they're not making major notable changes to the space. Things that do get renovated a lot more are like spaces in the West Wing, because they aren't as historic, like non-Oval Office spaces. They aren't as historic. If you look at images of West Wing offices through 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, you'll see that they've undergone some significant changes. Obviously, the addition of the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, I mean, of the Situation Room in the West Wing, that's something that is continuously renovated, sometimes expanded. More rooms get kind of like sucked into it, more space gets sucked into it. So those are the kind of things that happen. I think maybe the last visible renovation that happened, and it's fitting that we're looking at the Rose Garden here, was during the first Trump administration. There was a renovation of the Rose Garden. Those trees that you see along the colonnade were removed, and there were big changes made to the grounds of the Rose Garden. Those changes that were made actually made the Rose Garden better for growing more plants. It made it a better garden. It improved what you could actually grow there. It improved the drainage, and it also made the Rose Garden ADA accessible, which is a really nice and important thing, because that, of course, is a space where a lot of press conferences and events are held. So it actually made the Rose Garden a much more useful, accessible space.
Thank you.
Mhm.
And we're trying to get to as many as we can. I know there are a lot of questions. One of the questions here is about another story that we often hear about the president getting stuck in the bathtub. Is that true? Or is there any truth to that, or is
Mhm.
those one of the myths?
Yeah, a fun children's book out there, President Taft is Stuck in the Bath. That is also a White House myth. William Howard Taft did not get stuck in a bathtub in the White House. He was a very heavy president. He actually dropped a lot of weight later in his life after his presidency, made a lot of diet and exercise changes. If you look at pictures of him as president versus pictures of him as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which he felt like he said that was his true calling after his presidency. He was a much slimmer figure, but he did not get stuck in the bath. He did, however, have an oversized bathtub installed in the White House during his administration. And if you look around online, you will be able to find a photo of some workmen actually sitting in this bathtub, and it's really it's like hot tub sized. Like there's 3 guys sitting in it comfortably, and like I don't even think their legs are touching, and they're on opposite sides.
Thank you for that.
Mhm.
I see a lot of people that mention that they have discussed that in class recently, so some wanted it to be true.
Yeah, fun book. Unfortunately, it's enough. Yeah.
Another question I see here is about people wanting to visit the White House. So how many rooms are there set aside to where, guests, the public can actually visit?
That's a really cool question, because something that the White House Historical Association has worked on over the last few months with First Lady Dr. Jill Biden was a revision of the public tour of the White House that had remained pretty much unchanged for the last 40 or 50 years. The rooms that you would see, you would come in the East Wing and you would just kind of look into the ground floor rooms, a handful of the ground floor rooms. So you would come in the East Wing, you'd go through the ground floor, you'd go up the steps, and then you would go through the East Room, the Red Room, the Blue Room, the Green Room, the State Dining Room, and then you'd exit to the entrance hall and go out the front door and leave. With the revision to this public tour, you can actually go into several more rooms on the ground floor. You can now enter the China Room, the Vermeil Room, and the Map Room. You can actually walk into the rooms. And now, for the first time ever on a public tour, you can go into the Diplomatic Reception Room, which is the oval room under the Blue Room. And that's the room that the president walks in and out of, on the way to and from Marine One. So that's a really cool addition to the tour. And then on the state floor rooms on the first floor, you actually have more access and can move around the rooms a little bit more. They've done away with a lot of the stay inside the ropes kind of stuff. You can explore the spaces a lot more. If you want to see what you can actually go and explore on a White House tour, on a public tour, the virtual tour that we have on our website, that was all captured in 2020. One of the few upsides of the pandemic was we were able to get inside the White House and capture all this 360 imagery. You can walk through all those rooms of the White House in 360 degrees, and we take you on the exact tour route of the public tour. And we also have educational materials to support it if it's something you want to do in the classroom with your students.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one of the things with 2020 being able to digitize a lot of this. So I'm excited. I know there's been a lot of resources digital that have been shared in the chat. I just want to again thank you, Ken and Anna, for your time and the partnership with the White House Historical Association. Before we go and before we sign off, I do want to remind our teachers that are on here about the survey that will be coming at the end. I'm going to go ahead and pop that into the chat as well. That way you can have access to it. We want to make sure that we get some feedback that we can share about our programs tonight. And then also I'm going to drop in the chat. This is just for our EDGE teachers that are here on the call. We do have a sign-in sheet for tonight just to make sure that I can capture your attendance. So I'm going to drop that, and that's just for our EDGE teachers. Additionally, I want to make sure that everybody on here is aware that we have continuous webinars and partnerships that we update frequently. And so I'm going to mention two that are coming up soon. We have The Roots of Resilience, Teaching Enslavement with Empathy for Young Learners. That's going to be with Destiny Warrior. That's on November 20th. And then we have Black Homesteaders on the Great Plains, Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. And that's a partnership with the National Park Service. And so I will drop the link there for everyone. Again, I just want to say thank you so much, Ken and Anna. And is there anything else that you want to add before we sign off for the night?
I saw there were a bunch of questions I didn't get to in the chat. I apologize about that. If you want to ask those questions, this is where you can find us, education@whha.org. Or if you've got questions about our programs and resources, please go ahead and reach out there. And then that QR code was to join our mailing list, our teacher-only mailing list. Again, we don't email that much. So we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to see from you, and we'd love to help you in whatever way you can, in your classrooms and with your students.
Thank you all so much. Thanks, Dalton and Chelsea.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again, and really appreciate the attendance tonight, and look forward to seeing everybody back at an NCHE webinar again soon. For the EDGE teachers, I see that some of you are still searching for our sign-in sheet, and so I'm going to go ahead and drop it in just one more time. That way you can be sure to sign in for us tonight. Okay, so give me just one moment there. For everyone else, please please enjoy the rest of your evening, and then we look forward to seeing you soon. Okay, I just now dropped it into the chat again for you guys. Again, just make sure that we get your attendance there for the EDGE teachers. Thank you. And if you missed it, teachers, I will be sure to send that in a follow-up email. Okay. Everyone have a good rest of your night, and I will see you soon.